I need to know everything, who and the what and the where, I need everything. Trust me, I hear what you're saying, but act like it's new what you're telling me. I'm curious, George, I hop in the Porsche, 5 and a horse, I'm ready for war, I'm coming for throats, to turn to a ghost, I need to know everything.
Okay, hello and welcome to the Counter Narrative Show. I'm your host, Rasheem. Today's topic we'll be discussing, having a conversation, and the topic is From Protest to Policy. Today we are joined by Dayvon Love. We are going to get into a lot of the conversation around so many of us have been protesting. We've had signs, we've messed up some really nice sneakers, we have written on cardboards, we've gotten in lines, all of these things. And then a lot of the conversation is what is next? What do we do next? How do we go from here? This is where we figure out, or we start to have the conversation around where to go from here and how to make some real meaningful, long-lasting and impactful change to go beyond the protests, beyond the hashtags, and actually what can we do moving forward. And to have that conversation, I have the delight, pleasure of being able to speak with Mr. Dayvon Love. Dayvon, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate you for inviting me.
We were just talking about how busy you've been. I'm sure you've probably had a few of these conversations over and over again, time and time again. I bet you're in high demand right now.
Something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Dayvon Love is for people who don't know, which I just imagine that everyone knows. Dayvon Love is the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. In fact, in 2010, Dayvon Love co-founded Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And like other members of LBS, Dayvon believes that all groups and campaigns that endeavor to fix policies that harm predominantly African American communities must be led by African Americans. In Baltimore, that covers a bevy of issues, including affordable housing, economic development, education, and criminal justice reform. Dayvon, I want to start the conversation by talking about a little bit about how you came to this work. In reading some other things around your beginnings, I read how you started with debate. Can you talk about that bridge or that link that's from debate to getting into policy and then to LBS?
Yep. So, there's a lot of aspects to it. So in high school, I came across policy debate. In the late 80s and throughout the 90s, there was an effort to develop and to provide access to the activity of policy debate to Black folks all across the country. So there were urban debate leagues that emerged, Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, et cetera. And so Baltimore was one of those cities in the late 90s that got an urban debate league. And so I participated. And one of the things that for people to know about policy debate is one of the most rigorous forms of academic debate that exists. So a lot of people that, come out of major think tanks and that shape public policy come out of this activity of policy debate. So I did it in high school, got a scholarship to go to college. And one of the things I became clear about is that on the highly competitive national level, it was an overwhelmingly white activity, right? In terms of the participants and even in terms of the pedagogy and research methodology. I happened to, I happened to come into the activity during an intellectual and academic innovation in the activity. At the University of Louisville, Dr. Eddie Warner and Daryl Birch crafted a form of debate, and they came out of the Pan-African Studies department there, crafted a form of debate that looked at combining personal experience, what they called organic intellectuals, which in their case, they used hip hop artists and traditional academic authors as a practice of debate to challenge the norms and procedures of traditional debate. And it actually culminated in 2004 in the team of Liz Jones and Tanya Green, two Black women that got to quarterfinals of both national championship tournaments, making these innovative arguments. My college debate partner, he's a year older than me, he went to University of Louisville in 2006. He was there for 2 years. He transferred back to Towson University, where I went, to debate with me. And him and I kind of extended on, kind of the foundation they laid down. And so Deven and I, in 2008, we won a national championship, making arguments about racism and white supremacy in the activity of policy debate.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we were done with the activity, myself and many of my colleagues in the activity, we saw how a lot of the people we were debating against were being a part of major institutions that were protecting the interests of, major corporate institutions, right? And so what we thought to ourselves was, well, why don't we develop an organization in Baltimore that allows us to be the public policy arm of Black folks? Because what we saw was we didn't feel like there was that radical Black voice in the policymaking space that would help us to be able to challenge the institutions that do harm to our community. So that's kind of in a nutshell, how I got into the work.
No, I mean, it totally makes sense. Like, it almost seems like the perfect logical next step, the way that you have it laid out. And I actually did not know a whole lot about the difference between like debating and then like policy debating. I am curious to know specifically what makes policy debating more rigorous.
So policy debate, if you ever watch one, it's not very accessible. It's very jargon laden, very research laden. And so what you'll find is that like oratorical skills and flourish is deprioritized in the name of rigorous argumentation and research, right? And so there's a Donald Rumsfeld. He once said that the most powerful person in the world is the person who decides the high school and college debate topic, because it's the topic where, that person decides what some of the smartest people in the country are talking about. There's another study that was done that says that a year's worth of work in college debate is the equivalent of a master's thesis. And back before everything was so digital, debate teams would walk around with big totes of evidence, right? Like really big totes with evidence, because you did extensive research on every possible area of the topic. So if the topic was on foreign policy, you had a whole bunch of different, you basically, again, back before everything was so digital, you might Xerox excerpts from a book, put them on a piece of paper, and you have a bunch of pieces of paper that are like the material you use, in debate. And so again, it's an activity that is not very audience friendly. You'd have to be a person, there's a study that showed that, folks talk like 400 words a minute. So you have to have like a special ear to even hear like how people are talking. And it's a very insular activity. One example, this is a story about, so I mentioned that I won nationals in 2008. That was my junior year. So our senior year, we got invited to an exclusive tournament called the Kentucky Round Robin. So this is where mid-season, the top 8 teams in the country debate each other, right? And it was in a Kentucky country club, right? Where, and so it was just one of the most surreal experiences, because, Deven and I, my debate partner, are the only Black people in this room of like very wealthy, well-connected, white folks.
And let me tell you the name Kentucky, listen, I would not have felt safe. So bold for y'all for even stepping in that space.
Yeah. And so that's just to get a sense of like how it's a very insular activity. I remember like in octa finals of the national debate tournament in 2009, we're debating the son of the governor of Kansas. Like, it's that level of elite folks that participate in the activity. And these are people that are being prepared to wield power, right? And that for us was the thing that was really intriguing. Like, oh, these are folks in the policy realm. They're clear that this is where power is. We need to have something in our community where there's the clarity to see that policy is a really important lever of power.
Absolutely. And it also sounds like, from what you're saying, as you're talking about how insular it is, you have a specific audience that's going to be really keyed into that. Like, there's probably specific spaces where policy debaters are like super celebrities.
Yep.
I definitely, definitely totally get that. And it also makes sense as you talk about this connection with debating policy and then becoming a think tank. Can you talk a bit about think tanks? So what exactly is a think tank? What does that mean? And why is it important that African-American communities have one?
So I'm gonna go back to the piece around policy debate producing people influential in the policymaking arena. The
Mm-hmm.
activity of policy debate was very connected to the conservative revolution that culminated in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So when you think about the response to the civil rights movement, to the anti-war movement, Black Power movement, the response were that the conservatives developed a bunch of civic and political institutions to fight back against the gains of the 60s and early 70s.
Okay.
And so a part of their strategy was the development of think tanks, because what they understood is that the people in elected office aren't the people coming up with the ideas. They needed a specific organized institution that its responsibility would be to develop the intellectual basis for the activity of the elected officials that they would support. So there's a book that the Heritage Foundation published in the 90s called The Power of Ideas. And in it, they brag about the fact that during the 80s, they were in control of 80% of federal policy, right? Because again, they literally were the brains behind the elected officials, the Republicans. They were the brain behind them, right? And able to essentially use the depth of knowledge that they were able to develop to essentially give Ronald Reagan and the conservative Newt Gingrich and others their playbook. And so for us, when you look locally in Baltimore, there are institutions that provide a playbook to our elected officials. And, those conversations, aren't really, that public. Like there isn't kind of mass conversation about what is contributing to what elected officials decide to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at, the folks that are driving the conversation, we're talking mostly about institutions, like, Johns Hopkins, right? Or major foundations. So like the Able Foundation, for instance. You're talking about major institutions who are convening the conferences, the work groups, and producing the reports that become the basis for what elected officials do. And so as LBS, we kind of taken it upon ourselves to say we need to produce materials that can provide the talking points for people that are sympathetic to our perspective to be able to know what to say. Because
Right.
I mean, even given some of the work that we do, like the legislative advocacy that we do, it's just a lot of stuff to keep track of. You know what I'm saying? And unless you have a person who can spend that dedicated time keeping track of it, it's just a lot. So we really see it as our responsibility to keep track of a lot of that stuff and be able to tell our base to say, hey, here's everything that's happening. Here's what we think we should do, provide that for the community.
Yeah, I feel like that's so very much needed. And I think you kind of spoke to it earlier when you were talking about you being on a debate, not being a part of the debate, but also policy debate and how insular it is and how it's a specific audience. So then to take that level of information, that level of rigor, and then to be able to make it consumable to a wider audience who are directly impacted by it. How do you explain or how do you share with communities, particularly African-American communities, the significance of policy and how policy impacts their everyday life? Because, my uncle or my brother, I think they don't have that connection to policy to know that they just know something's wrong or it's effed up and they don't know why. So how do you bridge that to helping people to understand why is policy important for my everyday life?
Yeah. So there are two parts to that. The first is that it's important for people to recognize that it's intentional, that people are, that those spaces are so insular. So I'll give a couple examples. The Maryland Democratic Party, right? So Maryland is a Democratic Party stronghold, right? And what the Democratic Party does in the state, and it's not an official policy, but what you don't see the Democratic Party do is do mass voter registrations, right? The reason why they don't do that is because Maryland is one of those states that very soon, in fact, I think the population under 18 are majority non-white. And so what the Democratic Party doesn't want to do is to register so many people that the handpicked folks that they want aren't able to get elected pretty easily. So what they like to do is make the voter turnout low because they can control the math on that and be able to put in the people that will propel the kind of corporate agenda that those who guide the Democratic Party in Maryland want folks to go. So it's important to note that, so what happens is, and anybody who's been a part of a political campaign in the state, if you're familiar with like Deven, right, which is a software the Democratic Party uses to, you know, identify voters who voted in the last 3 elections and to target their campaigns. And so so when you think about the strategy, most people running for office are discouraged from talking to people who aren't already involved, right? Because if you're not already involved, for them, you're investing money, resources, and time in something that you won't get your return on investment. So I say that to say, so that this first part is, there's a very intentional arrangement of institutions and processes that disincentivize bringing in people who should be brought in, right? But it's made very insular. The second piece to that is, I think a part of it is very few people, I would say, when you think about people of African descent in this country, you think about the fact that many, even those of us who've broken into the, you know, what we call the middle class, many of us have not been socialized in environments where it's understood that we are going to wield power, right? Many of us are taught, do good in school, get a good job, right? Do that job, get a retirement, all that. We're not, I don't think that there are very, very many conversations that are had with particularly young Black folks about what it means to build institutions to be able to wield power, or what it means to be in a position to make policy to be able to wield power. Whereas I've observed, you know, young white folks who are in households where it's explicit that they're being prepared to run the world, right? And so because they're being prepared to run the world, there's much more access to conversations about the way that policy impacts people's lives. And so I think, to your question, I think a part of the issue is that when you're not socialized to understand where power is, but in fact you're socialized just to get a good job and survive, right? Well, then conversations about policy seem less important. And so I think a part of the task before us is to help our own community understand the importance that, yeah, we should survive, make sure we can feed ourselves and our families, but we also need to make sure that we're preparing ourselves to be able to wield power, because that's where sustainable change is going to be. Otherwise, I mean, we got so many of our people working so hard and not getting nearly, you know, the return on investment that their labor deserves. And so I think that's where the conversation about policy comes in, because the simple question is, you know, we have the power to change the systems or to impact the systems that impact our lives. The question is, are we going to organize ourselves to be able to wield the power and to impact those levels of power? And again, usually the question of policy as it's in the public mainstream, it's usually not described that way, right? It's usually described in much more kind of like grandiose terms, when really, again, it's just, for me, it's simply, are we going to wield power or not, right? And policy is one of those mechanisms by which we can wield power.
I think, I mean, from what I'm hearing, it's not even just a matter of understanding the significance of policy, but also convincing folks that they can influence, or that they can have access to this power. Seems to be a challenge, even with something as simple as, you know, whether or not to vote. Like that's a simple thing that I think people are more and more discouraged around that piece. And it's, for me, I'm going to tell you, it's hard for me to have that conversation because I don't know where to find the hope to give you. You know what I mean? I don't know how to convince you to buy into this system that you've already seen isn't just, even when you play by all of their rules.
That's right.
So for me, it seems like it's a really challenging conversation to have, to not even just to explain policy, because I think on the basic level, I could explain policy, like think of it as rules, and think of it as some rules benefit people and some rules put people at a disadvantage. And if you could change the rules, then you have access to that. I think the challenging part is to say, you actually you can actually influence the rules, you know, especially for people who haven't influenced rules on any level.
Yeah, you know, the older I get, the more clear that I am about the fact that one of the major impacts of the system of white supremacy in the society is the is the internalization of notions of Black inferiority. You know, and I think it's really deep. I think many Black folks are socialized to believe that the only way we can access power is if white people give it to us, right? And most people who I think believe that wouldn't admit that they believe that, because I think it's one of those truths that's just really deeply sublimated into people's consciousness. But so even like using voting as an example, like when I'm talking to people about the importance of voting, one of the things I say is, I said because all of us that vote are not voting because we buy into the system, right? We're thinking strategically about how to use it. And one of the things I say to folks is like, if you vote, I talked earlier about like the software that people use for campaigns to determine. I said, if you vote, and it literally not mattering who you vote for per se, but if you vote, you become a person that now is on the list of people they want to go talk to, right? And so it's an example of like, yeah, I don't believe in American democracy. It doesn't exist, right? I don't believe that America is going to be a just place. I believe what Derek Bell said: racism is a permanent feature of American society. But if we talk about the importance of voting, we don't necessarily have to talk about it in terms of buying into the system or not. We can talk about it from the perspective of, if more of us vote, that means that they're going to come talk to us. And it gives us more leverage to be able to impact the kinds of people that run for office, and ultimately the kinds of policies that get pushed through, you know, the system.
One of the listeners, Mona Diallo, says, I remember those days the White Hat required reading as well, or the White House had required reading as well. Franca said, we need politics that actually value voter enfranchisement. Ty shared, how do we get our communities to believe that they can wield power when there are so many examples of powerlessness? And I think that was kind of a bit of like what you were speaking to. You talked a bit about, we talked a bit about Maryland. One of the questions that I have in general is like, what is your take on the general political climate as it is today, and the impact of being able to bring forward or move forward conversations around criminal justice reform, and not even just the conversations, but what is the current climate? How does the current climate contribute to policy being moved forward around it, or has it?
So I'm gonna start real big picture and get narrow.
Okay.
So real big picture, and it relates actually to something that I just mentioned. One of the things I just get increasingly concerned about is, and we talked a little bit about this off air, many of the people who are appearing as folks that are experts on issues that impact Black people, what I'm observing is many of them have not dedicated serious energy in rigorously studying the history of the kinds of work that needs to happen, and rigorously studying the mechanisms of power. The reason I say that, and the reason that's important, is because what I think animates this general landscape is white folks are clear that the appearance of racial injustice is bad for business, it's bad for the moral authority of America as an idea. And so the capitulation to issues of racial justice is about that. And what they're clear about is there's a difference between those that are disruptive to the ability for white folks to wield power versus those that are articulate about racial oppression, right? And a part of what happens is we're getting more people that have mastered the sociology of the dimensions of Black people's suffering. What I don't see happening is the depth of knowledge of the bodies of work that people of African descent have produced off the mainstream as instruments for our liberation. And so what's happening is, I think many of the political thrusts that we'll see are heavily influenced by white institutions, white progressive liberal institutions, curating which Black voices get elevated. And they're going to curate the Black voices that get elevated, but are not talking about fundamentally undermining white institutional power to make decisions about where resources go and making decisions. So the reason why I want to start big like that, because in the state of Maryland, as I mentioned earlier, it's a Democratic Party stronghold. So even though we have a two-term Republican governor In some states, he'd be a moderate Democrat. And so what you have is you have a legislature that wants to claim to be progressive. And a part of the legislature's claim to be progressive, a part of what they're going to do is they're going to elevate certain voices and diminish others, right? So a part of what I'm concerned about in this current landscape is that there are people who are connected to the Democratic Party establishment, who are going to be the Black voices for Black people, right? And the question we got to ask as a community, what we have to ask them is, you know, to what extent are they accountable to Black people who are not adjacent to a lot of these white political and financial networks, as opposed to being, you know, appendages of the Democratic Party machine. And even locally, you know, I mean, you know, I think one of the questions that I think remains to be answered, you know, Brandon Scott is going to be, you know, the next mayor of Baltimore, if the trends that have gone on over the past several years continue. And the question that there's to ask about, you know, Brandon Scott is, you know, to what extent will he be able to be accountable to Black folks that are not adjacent to some of the white progressive networks that were really pivotal in getting him elected, right? And I think that's a question that is going to be answered in our, you know, asking questions of him and seeing what him and his administration is going to do. Because, and I'll kind of end your, you know, answer this question on this, is that I think this question of the infusion of white liberals and progressives in positions of power in Baltimore locally, I think is a very instrumental question, because we're going to hear more about a willingness around like legalization of cannabis, about, you know, criminal justice reform, right? And one of the quotes that I find myself using a lot in talking to folks in the political realm is the, you know, the Malcolm X quote about how you can, you know, if you put a knife in a person's back 9 inches, pull it out 3, you can't say you've made progress. You have to pull it out and begin to heal before you can even talk about progress. And I'm concerned that, you know, they're gonna pull the knife out 3 inches and call that progress.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. And not only will they call it progress, there'll be folks who buy into it, and also name it progress, especially for those folks that you kind of mentioned earlier, that are propped up by those particular institutions. Since we're talking about Maryland and you mentioned Scott, I'm curious about, have you seen any changes since the arrival of the new Speaker of the House, Adrian Jones, or the new Senate President, Bill Ferguson? Have you seen any changes around them that might give you some indication of where things might be with Scott moving forward?
So I think the best way I can answer that is the change that I've seen is that me and my organization have more access to some backroom conversations. And I'm sure there are a lot of other people who are considered more progressive who are getting access to more backroom conversations. Now, the question is, does that translate into actually moving policy that usually wouldn't have been moved before?
Right.
And, you know, unfortunately, given the pandemic, for this past session, we weren't really able to test that and really see, you know, if this legislature would be much different. I think in the 2019 session, a part of the conversation, I think legitimate, was, you know, for folks to get their grounding, like for Speaker Jones to get her grounding, to, you know, learn the lay of the land, and same for, you know, Senate President Ferguson. But we'll see. And I think the biggest thing I would want to stress to people, and this is true of Speaker Jones, Senate President Ferguson, and, you know, eventual Mayor Brandon Scott, is that we're going to have to challenge them. Right. Even if they're nice to us, you know what I'm saying? Even if we're cool with them, you know what I'm saying? We're going to have to challenge them, you know what I'm saying? Because, I mean, people who mean well in those positions of power, I think sometimes it's easy for people to simulate, like, yeah, if I was them, I would do this. Right. And it's just very different when you're in the seat and you have all these powerful forces converging on you. We should not depend on a person's goodwill. You know what I'm saying? We're going to have to make these people do what needs to be done.
Absolutely. So on that note, are you seeing any incorporated resistance as a result of this change of the guard?
Yeah, what's interesting is think about Maryland, Baltimore, and Maryland politics, and I'm sure this happens other places. There's so much inside baseball, and there's so much like posturing that folks are doing, and so a lot of what at least I've observed is a lot of like hiding the ball. You know what I'm saying? And like, so people aren't clear about where stuff is coming from, and so so politics, particularly in Annapolis, the legislature is very slippery. The other thing is, in terms of incorporated resistance, there are legislators that I think have taken advantage of the opportunity to present themselves as being kind of progressive heroes or champions, right? And so, again, it's one of those things where it could be good if they use it in the way that they're willing it for the community, or it could be something they're using as a thing to pursue their next kind of ambition.
Right.
And so, there are people in the legislature who, and let me give two specific examples, because I don't want to be too abstract. Let me give two specific examples. So, State Senator Will Smith, he's a state senator out of Montgomery County. He's the current chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. So, LBS has worked on a lot of criminal justice related advocacy. So it goes through that committee. And the thing about Senator Smith is that, he's a person that on many issues, he's been good. He's somebody that's voted the way we needed him to. He's voted badly on some pieces of legislation in the past, but overall, he's someone that he's in a district that's very progressive, and he's Black, right? So there's a part of it where, and, he's somebody that is going to be very important to watch, right? Because, his first time as chair was last session. It was cut short by the pandemic. He's somebody that we're going to need to watch, right? And we're going to need to make sure we push him to live up to, I think, what he's kind of putting himself in position to be understood as. He made a comment in response to Governor Hogan, where he said he's not putting out any mandatory minimums, right? And then Hogan said something about him not deserving to be there. How genuine is that? We'll see. You know what I mean? But he's somebody that we're going to have to watch. And I don't want to go on too long.
No, you're fine. You're totally fine. You mentioned Hogan, you mentioned Smith, and I really want to talk about, two, very specifically two, within the Democratic Party, because there's certain people we know, you know what I mean? Like, I see who you are, and there are some people who we don't necessarily see. And I'm really interested within Maryland in terms of within the Democratic Party, the struggle that's going on between like this more corporate centrist Democratic person and then the more progressive Democratic. What is that struggle? And I'm curious who they're there for. Like who are they trying to please in those on those different sides?
Yep. So I think, it's a complicated question, because I think there are people who see, part of the issue is that there isn't a whole lot of ideological clarity, right? So I think, and so as a result, I think it makes it, that's what makes it complicated. So I've talked about Senator Smith. I'll give an example of somebody else that I think helps get to your question. So when the social unrest began, Speaker Jones announced a specific work group to look at policing. And the person she asked to chair that work group is a state delegate, Vanessa Atterbury, out of Howard County, right? Now, Vanessa Atterbury is interesting because, I like her personally. I find her to be a nice person. in terms of her politics, I see her as a moderate Democrat. She's somebody who voted for mandatory minimums, voted for the Johns Hopkins private police force. You know, she's someone who is a moderate Democrat. Having her chair the policing work group struck me as odd, because she's not somebody that I find to be somebody who has been a champion on issues of racial justice, right? And one of the things that, you know, in my conversations with her and others who I've made kind of similar comments about publicly, sometimes they reduce it to like, Dayvon, I thought we were cool, or, you know, why would you know what I mean? And what I say to people is, it's not a question, because I had this same argument with, or conversation with Alex Hughes, who's the chief of staff of Speaker Jones. She was also the speaker, the chief of staff under Speaker Bush. And I had written something that was critical of Luke Clippinger, who's the chair of Judiciary in the House and a Baltimore City delegate. And, you know, what I said to her, what I said to Alex Hughes, I said, look, you know, I don't know him personally, right? What I can tell is his legislative efforts and his public pronouncements. It's clear to me that he's not a champion of racial justice. And when I'm talking about racial justice, I'm not talking about like, do you think Black people are equal to white people? I'm talking about like fundamentally challenging the system of white supremacy, right? And all of its machinations. And so Delegate Atterbury, being the chair of the policing work group, to me felt like an example of that incorporated resistance, where, you know, Delegate Atterbury is someone who's moderate, right? And whose understanding of the issues of policing is not to the level of other legislators who have worked on this issue, right? If Speaker Jones would have had somebody like Delegate Eric Barron out of Prince George's County, right? Or somebody like even Stephanie Smith, who's the chair of the Baltimore City delegation. These are legislators who have pushed the envelope, right? These are legislators who have challenged the Democratic Party establishment, right? But these aren't the people who are given those very important posts, right? As it relates to, you know, and so I think that, so that's why I say it's complicated, because in terms of like the struggle, the incorporated resistance and the struggle between the corporate part of the Democratic Party and the more progressive, in Maryland seems to have mastered this art of incorporating resistance, of giving out the symbolic stuff, and not moving on some of the more substantive policy that's going to make a big impact. Now, with that being said, what I will say is, I think we do have an opportunity to make them go further than they're normally willing to go. Because I just think there's so much appetite for it. But again, we're going to have to make them do it.
So to that, you would say that this current climate and these recent protests may have some influence on moving the conversations around policy forward a little bit more, even if it's just because folks don't want to look bad?
I would say exactly that. I would say it's given us greater opportunities, but we're going to have to really push to make sure those opportunities are realized.
Right. I have another question, but before I get to that, I know one of the things you mentioned, you were mentioning, look out, you know, we need to keep our eye on this person. We got to challenge this person. I really want to know more and be able to tell people more about what holding these folks accountable looks like.
So I would say this, it's really important. Legislators care the most about people in their district, right? So I would say one of the most important things to do is to keep tabs on what your legislator is doing. And it may seem small. And one of the things I tell people is, it seems small to do this, but consistently writing to your legislator and periodically calling are things that legislators pay attention to, right? Because what they're clear about is people are representative of larger networks, right? And if someone who is active in their office has a bad experience, they understand that it'll impact them electorally. So really the bottom line is, because sometimes what people do is they'll talk to legislators that are not in their district, but may be important or influential. And one of the things I say to people is, connect to somebody who you know in that person's district and have that person contact and interface with that legislator. Because that's ultimately what, you know, legislators respond to. And in my experience of legislative advocacy, That's been one of the biggest things. The other thing I would say, in terms of being familiar with what your legislator does, find out what committees they serve on. The Maryland General Assembly website is actually pretty good about recording the hearings. And so I would make it a point to watch hearings in that committee that legislator is on. It's time consuming to watch some of the hearings, but if you really want to know what that person is saying in Annapolis versus what they're saying when they come back, like that is the place to really see it. You know what I'm saying? Because they're used to, a lot of these legislators are used to being able to tell us in Baltimore all kinds of stuff that isn't true because they know people haven't watched any of the hearings or haven't seen the stuff in Annapolis.
Is some of the work that you do around sharing basically like what folks have said in Annapolis?
Absolutely. That's what makes people really, I mean, legislators have gotten really mad at us because of that. Because it's almost, they almost have said it to me like, come on, why would you do that? Like, that's not, you know what I mean? Like, and in a friendly way, like, come on, and I've had to tell them, like, I'm not playing the game y'all are playing. Like, I'm just not playing that game. And I said, we can still be cool. I'm just playing a different game. And there are people who, like, won't speak to me anymore because they're like, you posted something on Facebook and that was messed up. And it's like, all right.
Right.
You know.
What can you tell us about the Pedagogy and Race Equity Bill?
So if I remember correctly, so you're talking about the this was an amendment to the Kerwin Commission bill,
right?
Yeah. So education in Maryland and education advocacy over for a long period of time has been overwhelmingly led by white folks, And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the conversation about education in Maryland and in Baltimore has centered on the question of money. And while money is important, I think one of the things that gets left out is the methods of educating children that are present in our school system. And I think those conversations happen kind of in meetings or convenings and stuff like that. But in terms of policy, like in Annapolis or with policymakers, that conversation is not very robust. And so a part of what happens is, and this isn't unique to education, but it's a place where it's rampant. There's a lot of profiteering off the suffering of Black kids, right? Whether it's the nonprofit sector, human social service, like there's a lot of profiteering off the suffering of Black people, particularly Black youth. And so our thought was, if we put something in the bill that mandates some things around racial equity, and we gave some really specific language, because sometimes you can say racial equity, that can mean a bunch of stuff.
Right.
We put some really specific language in there that would help to narrow it down so that you get more legitimate stuff. Our thinking was it would encourage certain professionals to be in the space and discourage others. Right. So that was the overall thinking. The amendment got watered down, and I don't even think it made it into the overall bill because of how rushed session ended this past session.
Right.
But that was the overall thinking, and I'll say this, and I think this is important for people to really get a sense of, is that I mentioned earlier that education advocacy in Maryland, for the most part, has been very much white-led. Not only that, but it has also been the case that approaches to socializing Black kids in these majority white spaces, I would argue, have had a negative impact on Black youth in ways that nobody's studying, because you're not going to get a grant for that. Like, you're not going to get a grant for how white nonprofit organizations or white education institutions hurt Black children. But I would argue that that is a harm that is done to Black children that we need to come to grips with. Right. I had a conversation with the chairwoman of appropriations, Maggie McIntosh, a couple of years ago about this question. And what she admitted to me pretty frankly was that the concerns that I were raising are not concerns that she was really deep into.
Wow.
You know what I'm saying? Like the question, like for her thing was about, poverty being a proxy for race.
Right.
You just get more resources then. And what I explained was that if you're not using the methodologies of socialization that people of African descent have produced to socialize and raise our kids to be fully functional human beings, they can actually do more harm than good. That's not a concept that many people who are the staunchest advocates for education understand, and in fact are freaked out by. Because for some people it's a business model. Right? Their business model is, we need more money for kids in after school programs.
Right.
You know, so that's what made us put that bill. And we understood that bill that turned into an amendment would be an uphill battle. And there are even Black legislators that don't quite get the importance of that. You know, but we thought it was important to at least put the conversation out there so that as a community, we can begin to have that conversation and figure out how to intervene.
No, that's super important. I feel like I got to have you on just so that we could talk about that a little bit more. Can you tell folks, what should we know, particularly people in Maryland, what should we know about the Maryland Public Information Act?
So one of the important things about police accountability is the question of how is it that people can know what law enforcement officers are doing? So I testified in front of the judiciary, and one of the questions I posed to the committee members was, if I were to ask you, is there a gun trace task force in other jurisdictions? Your only legitimate answer is, I don't know. And the reason for that is because of the Maryland Public Information Act, which is kind of in the category of workers' rights, right? Or the rights of public employees. Because the idea behind the Maryland Public Information Act is to say, you know, the constituents should have access to what government's doing. But when it comes to personnel, workers have rights to not have their stuff over scrutinized and their personal information out there. So I can't do a Public Information Act request on someone's health records, right?
Right.
That's, you know,
reasonable.
So that's what. Now what happens is that the investigatory and disciplinary file of a police officer under Maryland law is considered a personnel file and therefore not subject to the Maryland Public Information Act, right? So that presents an issue, because what that means is that if an officer has a history of abusing the community, the only people who have access to that information is people within the department. And so that's one of the pieces of legislation that we focused on last session, which was amending the MPIA such that these disciplinary files and investigatory files were not considered protected by the PIA. And I'll tell you, some of the conversations and arguments we had both with the police chiefs and sheriffs and with the chairperson of the committee, because what we were asking for, you know, there's a whole bunch of things within the law, within the police department in terms of discipline, some of which I don't care about. Like, an officer doesn't, you know, put their uniform on right, and I don't care about that. I don't need that. You know what I'm saying? Or, you know, and even stuff like if an officer is caught, I don't know, having an extramarital affair, like I don't care. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But we were asking for a list of things that we wanted to know about officers, which was use of force, sexual assault, you know, their veracity and dishonesty. I already said use of force, criminal activity, right? So there was a list of things kind of along those lines, and we wanted the full file made available. The concession that we were given from both the chairperson and the police chiefs and sheriffs was, we'll give you all of what they call the sustained findings. What that means is that when a complaint is lodged against an officer and the investigation happens, when it ends, there are a bunch of categories, but there are two major categories. You'll have either sustained or unsustained, right? Sustained means we found that you did something wrong. Unsustained means we don't know if you did something wrong. We can't substantiate whether this claim is true or not. They only wanted to give us the sustains, to which we said, no, we don't want the ones that you investigated and you thought were legitimate. We want all of the investigations that are done.
Right.
And
especially if there's a pattern. Like
exactly.
you not finding whatever doesn't mean anything to me. If there's a list of unsustained ones, that's a red
right. flag. Exactly. So that was exactly our point. And that was different. They, you know, if session had gone on its normal length, I don't know that we would have reached the compromise. I think unsustained was off the table for them. Now, again, given the current social unrest, I think we may be able to get more. But yeah, the police chiefs and sheriffs, they were real clear with us. And what they say is, they say that they don't want a whole bunch of the officers' personal information to be put out there and used against them. And particularly, they were talking about in the case of needing an officer to testify, in the case of like if they're prosecuting a homicide case, and this officer was someone who was a witness, that having the unsustaineds would make that officer not a good witness. To which what we said was, then you need better police officers that are not going to get all these different.
Why is that?
You know what I mean?
Why is that a legitimate argument in the first place?
Right.
So, wow. I think one of the things that I find most shocking about the Maryland Public Information Act is some of the things that I would think would be automatic and reasonable for the public to know. If you did have excessive force and you've had a pattern of excessive force, I feel like the public should know. If you do have criminal activity, the public should know. If you do have something around sexual assault on your records, sustained or unsustained, that should be public information. That's not the same as whether or not you have diabetes, whether or not you cheated on your wife,
exactly.
Whether or not you got 2 demerits for coming in late. So that's definitely something that I hope is pushed through, because there's so many times where I hear about a shooting and then I'll hear about their record and they've been doing all of this stuff the whole time. And it's like, you know, you want to say to me body cameras and police reform, but this guy's been showing you who he was. This was never hidden from you. More to that, all of these police protections, can you talk to us about the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights and what is that?
So Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, LEOBR, it was codified, I believe, in 1974. And it's a set of protections that outline discipline, but it in my estimation, gives officers rights above and beyond their constitutional rights. So just a few examples of what I mean. One of the ones that people kind of latched on to is that officers have 5 business days before they're required to make a statement on the record in an incident where they've alleged to have engaged in excessive force, right? Officers are entitled, when an officer does something, the police chief hands down discipline, the officer doesn't want to take the discipline, it goes to a trial board. Now, before 2016, there was a prohibition of non-police officers to serve on those trial boards. What we were able to do in 2016, which was the most we were able to get accomplished, but not enough nearly, was that we removed the prohibition. So now you can have non-police officers on the trial boards. Now that requires the commissioner to act on that. But it's one of those protections where, you know, you're going to have mostly police officers adjudicating issues with other police officers. An officer is entitled to all the information against them, you know, when they're subject to the trial board. So all the information against them is subject to all that information. Only sworn law enforcement can participate in the initial internal investigation of an allegation of excessive force, right? So these are just examples of all of the protections that police officers get. And so the reason why this is important is because, you know, police are they're normally policing and investigating themselves, and they clearly have a professional interest in protecting each other. And actually, Maryland is the first state to have had a law enforcement officer Bill of Rights. And in fact, in 1975, there was a conference held in Maryland on the Eastern Shore of fraternal orders of police around the country to model a law enforcement officer bill of rights in other states. And so now we're one of about 15 or 16 states that have a law enforcement officer bill of rights. One of them is Minnesota. Minnesota has a law enforcement officer's bill of rights. So yeah, and again, it's one of those things that is framed in terms of worker protections. Right. And this is one of the things that the FOP and the police hide behind. Is they say, well, we are employees like anyone else. We deserve, the same protections that other public sector workers get. And a part of what, we say in response is that if they, public safety is a public good, right? They're supposed to be accountable to us. How can we hold them accountable if we don't know? If we don't have access to information to know what they're doing. So that's the LEOBR, the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights.
And speaking of protection, I know a lot, I've been hearing a lot more around, and I'll make this a two-part because we're getting to the bottom of the hour. Can you tell us about one of the ones that I hear about most right now are qualified immunity and police union contracts in terms of police protections? What are those and how are police shielded by those two things?
So I'll start with the police contracts is the most important one. The qualified immunity part is, to me, is an appendage of a larger issue of how officers are prosecuted and the tools people use to get information about what police are doing. The Fraternal Order of Police is central in this because, as I talked about, the PIA and the LEOBR are all in terms of the legislative frame, are put in the context of workers' rights. The FOP contracts are the places where a lot of power is wielded about the nature of how law enforcement is conducted. Because of the laws around collective bargaining, only the collective bargaining unit and management are able to be in conversation with each other about what they're negotiating. There's no way for the public to be involved in the actual negotiation. So what happens is there's a lot of stuff about what law enforcement are required to do and the protections they have that are in the collective bargaining contract. And so I would even argue, when you think about the fact that in Baltimore, public safety policing is a third of the budget, and you think about the fact that in many respects, the FOP is subsidized in large part by public dollars, right? I've often described them as a special interest group subsidized by public dollars, right? And so I think those police union contracts are really important. I think that one of the things that is going to be important for Baltimore is we need to have conversations with Brandon Scott, who's eventually going to be mayor, to have a conversation about how we want him to negotiate on the contract and be active on the kinds of things we want to see in it, since it's prohibited by law for that process to be public. And I think a part of what we're going to have to do just as a community is a part of how we elect people to public office is going to be based on what we expect from them as negotiators on these contracts.
Right.
Because I think a lot of the internal practices of law enforcement in various municipalities are governed by what's in the contract, and these contracts down to how you fire somebody, down to how complaints are handled. Like, there's just a bunch of things in those contracts that have a lot of influence. And I would advise people to just look up the contract that Baltimore has with the FOP, and you'll see all the stuff that they're able to negotiate.
That is a lot. I'm going to go over to the audience. Crystal says, Paulo Freire suggests we do this through, I'm not going to say that word right, conscientization? How do you say that word? How do you say it?
I say conscientization. I don't know that I'm saying it right, but
which is developing a critical awareness of one's social reality through reflection and action. Action is fundamental because it is the process of changing the reality. Paulo Freire says that we all acquire social myth, which have a dominant tendency. And so learning is a critical process, which depends upon uncovering real problems and actual needs. Thanks for sharing that, Crystal. And Aubrey just says, I'll just put this out there. How do we syndicate your show? I'm just saying. Thanks. Wow, you've given us so much, and there's like so many more questions I could ask you. a lot of them around, are around, there's so many attempts at reform, these body cameras, bias training. I don't know if there's any evidence that have pointed to these leading to any reduction of excessive force. I haven't seen any, and I've actually looked, but you, with your eye, have probably seen more. So I'm curious about that if you have. And then the last question I'll ask is around, tell us about community-led policing and what does that look like?
So on the first question, I concur with the observation that there is no evidence that those efforts, in fact, LBS was an organization that when Ferguson happened and the national, conversation around policing really started to pick up, we were really clear that, in fact, body cameras is, in many respects, another excuse to give more money to police, right? And that police don't need. The other thing is that, so cameras, training, this is all more money to law enforcement. What's important for folks to recognize is that the question that we're dealing with on law enforcement is about power to discipline. Everything else is secondary. The community should have mechanisms of oversight such that they can dispense discipline. And to put it even more simpler, if an officer knows that no one's going to be able to find out the things that they've done, and they have entire institution organized around keeping it from the public, then people are going to feel comfortable doing things that show a lack of regard for the humanity of Black people. And so for me, that's the fundamental thing. Everything else is secondary, right? Because you can have the camera footage, right? They can turn it off. It could be not visible in court. It could be narrated as something. You could start the camera at one point and end it at a. So it's about the power to discipline. In terms of so I think that when we think about non-Western societies, when we study non-Western societies, we see that the function of police and prisons is a particularly unique thing in the West, right? That non-Western societies don't have as central to them policing and prison apparatus, right? And part of the issue is that many of us are not socialized in our professional academic training to really rigorously study the political economy of non-Western societies. So we're taught to see them as more primitive and less advanced.
Right.
But if we look at some of the highly advanced civilizations, both in indigenous American societies or indigenous African societies, we will see that that there are ways of social organization that don't require police and prisons. And so I think so the ultimate vision is to imagine a world where we don't need police and prisons. I think the steps to getting there, has to do with rethinking what it takes to address issues of violence and crime in our community. So a part of what happens, I think, is that when you see people talk about like homicide, right, and we need to, do something about the violence, we put it all in one box, right, and we just say it's all. But to me, there's a very big difference between a fight that just escalated out of control and a retaliation related to some drug trafficking stuff, right? Like there are different. Violence it encompasses a bunch of things, and so a part of it is developing a community-based, community-led, institutional responses to some of these issues, so that police are not deployed to situations that they're not very useful for.
Right.
So one example, when you think about things like conflict resolution, like one of the things, because of just the divestment in the Black community, and just in many respects, the evisceration of many of our social networks, we don't have as a community widely understood, widely bought into mechanisms of conflict resolution, right? If we had that, I imagine there are a lot of situations that would decrease the amount of times police are deployed to particular situations, right? So I think a part of what we need to do is think about what are all these different issues that emerge in our community that we lump in this category of violence, and then build, different community-owned and controlled institutional formations that address those particular problems, such that police would be the last resort.
Is that the road to defunding or police abolition? Is that the road?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Absolutely.
And the question that I was going to ask you at the end, which I feel like you already answered, was around like, what can the average citizen do? What can people do right now and today? And I feel like you talked a bit about, calling your legislation, writing letters to them, watching what they're doing in sessions and that sort of thing. In closing, I'd like to hear more about what you're up to next. How can people follow you, get connected, and support some of the work you're doing?
So a few things. One is, of course, like and subscribe to LBS Baltimore and all your relevant social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, lbsbaltimore.com. We're involved in a lot of stuff. Lady Breon, who's on the leadership team of our group, is working on the Black Arts District over in West Baltimore on the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor. And in fact, last year we were able to get a state designation of the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor as a Black Arts District. And so the next steps in that is to work to get a building on Pennsylvania Avenue that would be a Black arts incubator and event space, to be a container for Black creatives. And I think one of the benefits to, this Black Arts District work is that, unfortunately, I think a lot of our Black creatives are having to be proximate and dependent on, white arts institutions. So I think for us, the beauty of the Black Arts District is to provide that alternative space to really be centered in the world and work of Black creatives. And Pennsylvania Avenue has a rich Black arts and culture entertainment history. And so, so one of the things in terms of support is just, make sure if you're talking to your city council person or your legislator, just tell them, you support that particular effort. That's something, big that we're working on. In terms of our legislative work, we're going to be, Indianapolis' coming session. We're working to repeal the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, to amend the Maryland Public Information Act. What we're also going to do is we've talked about it the past couple of sessions, but we're going to go, this session is going to be a big priority for us to look at the legalization of cannabis, with an emphasis on the revenues going to the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. Because part of what we're worried about, because it's interesting. I've heard some rumblings that there are legislators and folks in leadership that say that they're inclined to repeal the LEOBR, right, and inclined to move on some of the stuff that we've been pushing for. And sometimes what I think folks fail to realize is that, in many respects, we're not going as far as we'd like to go in terms of what we need. And for me, it would not be enough just to open the doors in terms of police accountability. We need resources for our communities to repair the harm that was done. Right. And so that's going to be a very important aspect of what we push for during the Maryland General Assembly. And for us, it's going to be like, even if you do all the good stuff on police reform, if you're not trying to repair the harm, it's still the same.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's so those are going to be big issues.
In connection with repairing the harm, is there any conversations around folks who have been arrested for distribution of cannabis? Like, is there anything connected with, okay, if we are going to legalize or decriminalize it, can we now go back to those folks and be like, my bad, you get to get out? Anybody talking about that?
So one of the things, we actually worked on a piece of legislation in the 2019 session, and we partnered with the state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, on a piece of legislation that would vacate marijuana charges. So it's different than expungement, because expungement is like if it's on your record, it got taken off. Vacature means it gets erased, like it never happened, right? So we were working on, it was a two-part vacature bill. So one part was the marijuana conviction vacature. The other piece was vacating convictions that were based on the testimony of corrupt police officers, paraphrasing there. we were able to get past that the first part around the corrupt officers and not the marijuana convictions part. And so that's something that we'll continue to work on, getting those things vacated. I imagine that any legalization bill will have a vacatur clause in it.
Okay.
And we're going to make sure that if legalization passes, that vacatur is a part of that piece of legislation.
Okay. Thank you again so much for your time, for joining us and talking about this. I could talk to you a whole lot more. I actually want to ask you to come back on at some point towards the end. I really want to talk more about the nonprofit industrial complex. I read, I'm pretty sure it was you who wrote the white paper or the black paper. Very, very good read. I have it somewhere around here, all highlighted and everything. So I would love to have you back sometime this month to go into a deep dive and just like exploring that a bit more.
Let's do it.
All right, yay! I'm gonna hold you to that. So stay on.
All right.
Thanks everyone for joining, for watching. Thank you everyone for all of your comments. Aubrey, Crystal, Ty, Franca, D. Jones, Luca, Jacinia, Angela Hannah, Derek McGowan, other people who decided not to comment but chose to show up and watch anyway. Thank you so much for all of your time and energy. Look forward to seeing you guys next week. Next Saturday, we will be discussing closing the digital divide. So join us next Saturday where we'll talk about closing the digital divide. Feel free also, if you have any additional questions, to go ahead and still write them in the chat. I'll make sure that they get forwarded along. What else? Is there anything else? Nope, I think that's about it. So thanks again, everybody, for showing up and being here with us, and have a good night. Bye.
I need to know everything, who and the what and the where, I need everything. Trust me, I hear what you're saying, but act like it's new what you're telling me. I'm curious, George, I hop in the Porsche, it's 5 and a horse, I'm ready for war, I'm coming for throats, to turn to a ghost, I need to know everything.